Hey everybody, Dr. Dan speaking, and welcome to your lecture on sound in Across the Universe. So I want to get started with a brief, very brief history of film sound, because unlike the other four elements of film form that we've been looking at so far this semester, sound has not always been part of the film experience, at least not in a consistent way. So, some of you may have seen a silent film, a film that was likely produced between the years 1895 and 1928. But in case you haven't, there was this whole 30-year period, so basically about 1/3 to 1/4 of the medium's lifespan, because film has only been around for about 120 years at this point. And for about 1/3 to 1/4 of that time, films were primarily shot silently. Now, they weren't shooting these films silently because they didn't want to have sound. Now, certainly some filmmakers argued, and would even still argue in some cases, that the image is the most important thing and that sound can only detract from what the image can show you, not add to it. But as this image from one of Thomas Edison's early experiments with film suggests, sound and the impulse to put sound on film has been with the medium from the very beginning of its existence. The problem was they did not have the technology to accurately and consistently sync that sound with the image. So if you look back in the history of film, and you look at a lot of the so-called silent films that were produced between 1895 and about 1928, you see sporadic attempts made to add sound effects to the image, to add certain musical songs to the image, so on and so forth. The problem was they could not get that technology consistently working well enough, often enough of the time, to make it viable on a large scale. So for most films that you saw between 1895 and about 1928, you were getting something that was shot and projected silently. And if there was any music or sounds in the experience, it was coming from the pianist, who would be sitting off to the side of the screen playing music to match the images. Or in some cases, if you were seeing a documentary or certain kinds of dramatic films, there would be a lecturer paid to effectively do what I am doing right now, give narration, provide context, to talk the audience through what they were looking at. So this really starts to change in the late 1920s. And if you read any film history textbooks at any point in your time as a film student, you will probably come across some mention of this film, The Jazz Singer. Now, The Jazz Singer is not the first Hollywood film in the late 20s to successfully experiment with adding sounds onto the soundtrack. There are a couple of films coming out in 1926 and early 1927 that are paving the way for what you see in The Jazz Singer. But The Jazz Singer is the film that is typically referred to as the turning point in film history. It's the film that, if you really were to rank, like, what are the 10 films that have had the most decisive impact on the way Hollywood tells stories, the way they make movies, The Jazz Singer would be right up there with Star Wars and Easy Rider and films like Birth of a Nation. And like Birth of a Nation, The Jazz Singer is unfortunately in that group of films where they're historically influential, but are not necessarily very morally correct, if you want to put it in very stark terms. I.e., both The Birth of a Nation and The Jazz Singer are paving the way for other filmmakers with respect to innovations in editing and sound and so on and so forth. But they are also deeply racist films. They are deeply invested in the blackface tradition you see kind of personified on the poster for The Jazz Singer. Very deeply invested in certain racist ideologies that were very common in the United States in the first part of the 20th century and still are in some instances. So this isn't a movie I can exactly recommend that you go out and see because it's such a great film. But it is a film that is historically influential, and literally overnight, this film comes out, and everybody in Hollywood who previously had been dismissing the idea that sound film would ever work, that like the talkies would be successful, they suddenly shut down production and spend several weeks dramatically retooling their entire industry for this new market in sound. Really, if you're looking for a parallel to how crazy it was for people in the film industry in this period of transition, the late 1920s, where sound comes into the picture for the first time, it's probably what happened in March of this year, where suddenly this model of let's put the movies into the theaters, and that's where they will live for a certain number of months before we finally deign to release movies on home video or through other platforms. Like, the amount of chaos that you have seen in the film industry over the last 6 months about what to do with film distribution in a world without movie theaters, that's pretty close in spirit to what Hollywood filmmakers and executives were doing in the late 1920s, when suddenly it became very, very obvious that this whole system of sound film or silent film was no longer going to work. And then all of these theaters that had been set up for silent cinema will now need to be outfitted with projectors. They're realizing that actors and actresses with very thick accents would need to be replaced with professional actors from the theater who could enunciate the dialogue. Musicians would have to be hired to write and record scores. The industry turned upside down overnight because of sound. And you had people like Greta Garbo, who had previously been able to get by with their heavy Swedish accents, or these heavy accents that audiences had no real way of understanding because it was silent film. Now like these people are having to talk, and some like Garbo made the transition. This was, of course, Anna Christie, who's promoted with the famous tagline, "Garbo talks, Garbo sings, Garbo laughs." But many, many other people lost their jobs and their livelihoods during this period. So I'm giving you this history not because this is a film history class and you really need a super in-depth history of sound to understand how it works in film, but I want to underscore a couple of really important points with this history. The first is that sound has not always been part of the picture. And the second point is when sound comes into play, it has done so almost exclusively in the service of the image. So just to repeat this point for emphasis, like 9 times out of 10, when you are thinking about film sound in film, it is subordinated to the image. It is there to illustrate or further clarify information that is already kind of being expressed in the image in some way, shape, or form. And that's a legacy, a direct legacy of the fact that a lot of the building blocks of mise-en-scène, cinematography, editing, and even performance, oddly enough, were established without this resource. And so much of the language of cinema, consequently, is kind of has been built with the image primarily in mind. So this hierarchy of image to sound, just hold on to that idea in your brains, because this will be a really, really important thing to think about and be aware of when we come back to Across the Universe in the second part of the lecture. But first, let's review some stuff. Let's review some common types of sound in films. So here are the 4 really common sounds that you are going to hear in a movie, any movie that you might watch for this class or another class. Now, as has been the case with the past few lectures, I am not going to be exhaustive in diving into all of the possible permutations for dialogue, for sound effects, for music, and for silence that exist. This is really just your overview, your broad categories of kinds of sounds, and you'll have to go through the textbook and look for where Bordwell and Thompson have highlighted subterms, basically, like other vocab terms that further break down these categories into smaller units. And you'll really want to just have those terms in the back of your minds for film analysis projects, for the exams, and of course for things that you're going to be doing for other people's classes when you are done with mine. But here they are. Dialogue, we all know what that is. That's any kind of talking, any sorts of conversation or monologuing that is happening in the film. Sound effects, catch-all category that refers to everything from ambient Foley sounds like footsteps and leaves rustling in the background to the really sort of big, obvious sci-fi like explosions and the stuff where you hear it and you're like, man, they really had to probably work hard on that sound to get it right. Music, we will talk more about music in the second half of the lecture because, as you know, the Beatles and their music figure very heavily into Across the Universe. But the last one that doesn't often appear on lists of sounds to think about that you may find in the internet or even in certain academic pieces of writing about film is silence. And all I can say about this right now is that the power of silence is enormous. Sounds can do a lot for your audience's ability to follow and comprehend your film. But a well-placed moment of silence can do so much to your audience's emotions, to how they are interpreting or responding to a particular moment. So don't just think about the presence of sound, is what I'm saying here. I'm telling you also that you should be thinking about the absence of sound as a significant meaning-making tool that filmmakers have when they make a movie. So, those are your categories of sound, but Bordwell and Thompson also identify 5 qualities of film sounds, 5 terms that we can use to describe how this particular sound sounds. So here they are, qualities of film sound: loudness, pitch, timbre, or I like to think of this one as tone. It's a little bit easier to remember. Rhythm and fidelity. Now, I'm not going to review these in great depth because Bordwell and Thompson have wonderful vocabulary, like style definitions for each of these, as well as plenty of great examples pulled from a variety of classic and recent films. So be absolutely sure that you are taking some time when studying for the exam to review what Bordwell and Thompson say about each of these categories and have those definitions in the back of your mind before you take the test. Because even though we are not going to be doing too much with these in like the kind of film analysis we're going to get to do in our class, it's really important to know that there are a number of different ways that one sound can differ from another. And all of these things working together add up to a sound that tells you something about a character or helps you relate to the world of the film in a different way than you can through just images and through editing and performance. So here are your qualities of film sound. Here's the question that I'm really interested in, and what you can be using these terms to accomplish. And that's the question of, how does sound make us see? Because as I've been saying throughout this lecture, sound always works in relationship to the images in film. Sounds rarely are being designed and inserted into a movie in isolation. Almost always the sound is being inserted for the purpose of affecting how we see, what we see, and how we interpret what we're seeing. And it does this in unpredictable and unusual ways. So to illustrate this point, I'm going to send you back to the media gallery section of the icon page and watch a few different clips that I have assembled for you. Now, the first set of clips that you'll be watching is from Abbas Kiarostami's film Taste of Cherry. And you're going to watch a couple of different versions of a scene from that film, which, to give you a quick summary of the plot, is about a man who is living in Tehran, the capital of Iran, and he is driving around because he is looking for somebody to help him commit suicide for reasons that are never explained in the film. It's just the film is very quiet, very minimalist, and 90% of the runtime is basically just watching this man drive around. And we are asked, the narration is always, always, always objective narration. We don't really get point of view shots or perceptual subjectivity. We don't really get mental subjectivity. So the film is just showing you this man driving around. And the first clip that you'll watch from this film is how it's actually presented in the movie, where you go and watch the full thing, just driving around, very, very quiet, not much happening. When you watch that scene, you want to be thinking, what is the silence or the lack of sound doing for your interpretation of the character? After you've watched that version, you'll take a look at a few other versions of this clip that I have uploaded. Pardon to Mr. Kiarostami, who may be rolling in his grave at the thought that I would do this to his film. But I've added some Taylor Swift and some Sir Mix-a-Lot to that scene. And so I want you to watch those alternate versions of the clip, because I want you to see how the decision to use music or not to use music has an enormous impact on how we read the main character's expression. And when you watch the clip, what I hope that you will see, because it is often what students see when I do this exercise in person, is that when you don't have any music, the man's eyes seem very empty and mysterious, and there's a strong impulse on the part of the viewer to imagine what he might be thinking or feeling as he drives around Tehran. But when you play the same clip with Taylor Swift or Sir Mix-a-Lot in the background, what happens is little subtle perceptions or little subtle facial expressions that the man might be doing with his eyes or with his mouth or with his hands, his body gestures. Suddenly you start noticing those things as the music kind of calls your attention to them, and your interpretation of the man's expressions is very, very different. So take a look at those different versions of the clip and see how the music frames the man's expressions in a different way, causes you to see things in the man's face that maybe you weren't seeing or weren't even there in the silent version. The second clip that I'm going to be, set of clips that I'll be showing you, is from a film called Barbarian Sound Studio, which I actually showed students in an earlier version of this class last year. And they weren't too crazy about it for reasons that you may or may not see. But the film is really, really great because it's about a sound engineer, and the scenes that I will be showing you from this film are really representative of the film's technique, which is to only show you the sound engineer process from the point of view of the sound engineer. So when you watch the scene, you are only going to be seeing the sound engineer at work. You will not be seeing a single frame of the film on which he's working. But you will be seeing it in your heads, because the sound effects are so well done that they've put images in your minds that are obviously not there for you to see directly in the film. So when you look at those clips from Barbarian Sound Studio, I'm hoping that you will notice how sound effects can get you to imagine things that are off-screen. And it's a similar principle to what's happening in Taste of Cherry, at least my modified version, where the music is alerting your attention to subtleties in performance that you might otherwise miss. But in both sets of clips, the main takeaway that I want you to have when you watch them is this is how sound helps us see things that we would otherwise not notice or not imagine without it. So take a look at those clips and see how that does that, because it's really cool. So now it's time to turn our attention to Across the Universe, and we'll review some ways that this film is using sound as part of its overall aesthetic strategy. So first, a little bit of background about Across the Universe. The film is coming out about 13 years ago, so fall of 2007. So this is coincidentally the very first fall that I'm a college student, although I did not see this film at the time. I saw it a few years later. And it was very, very divisive when it came out. There were a lot of people who looked at what this film was doing aesthetically and with this music, and the naysayers were being like, oh my god, this is just a big mess. This is just like this gangly, like 2.5 hour music video that's just balls to the wall, like crazy in terms of what it's doing with mise-en-scène and editing. It's all over the place. It's crazy. And a lot of people ragged on it for those reasons. But there were a lot of people who basically read those reviews, nodded along, and said, yeah, that's exactly what's happening, but why would you think that that means this is a failure? This is a marvelously creative film that is breaking all of the rules about what we've been led to expect from a mainstream Hollywood production. And surprise, surprise, I am in the second camp. I think this is just a marvelous film that does not have enough imitators. Although having said that, maybe that's one of the reasons it's so marvelous. Like Citizen Kane, or even to some degree Do the Right Thing. This is a film that is being sponsored and financed by a major studio, but yet it has the sensibility of an experimental film at times. Like, you really get a sense that the people who made this film were drunk on the possibilities of what their medium could accomplish. And one of the things that it does to break the norm, and this will be the running theme through this part of the lecture, is the film flips that normal ratio of image to sound. So in most Hollywood films, in most films general, period, what you have are images that dominate the filmmakers and the audience's attention, and sounds that illustrate what those images are already showing you. And what Across the Universe does is it flips that ratio. And what you see in Across the Universe is sounds are the thing that structure the film. Sounds are the thing that filmmakers have put the most energy and attention into. And it is the images which are subordinate to the sound. It's the images which add to or intensify qualities that are already in the sounds. And this is not the normal ratio of like sound to image that Hollywood filmmakers have been trained to use for almost 120 years at this point. And this is the reason why it is so divisive. There are some filmmakers and viewers for whom this approach just simply does not work because it just results in what they have not so charitably described as its music video aesthetic. But there are others like me, and hopefully for you as well, who see this as a wonderfully experimental gesture made within the context of a studio system which normally does not allow for this degree of creativity. And so when I watch the film, I'm not always as involved in the individual dramas as you sometimes get the sense they wanted you to be, but I'm always engrossed in what the filmmakers are doing. And like I said, hopefully you are too. But here's a good place to maybe talk a little bit about some of the people who made this film. Give you a sense of what kinds of people are working on these movies, and also to give you a sense of the multivariate paths that people have taken to careers in the film industry. And so Julie Taymor is just a wonderful, wonderful person for y'all to know about. Because she is not coming to Hollywood from the usual channels. She is actually coming to Hollywood cinema from the theater. And so if somebody like Adam Egoyan is bringing a very like academic kind of art film theory sensibility to his film productions, bringing what he knows from the university system to bear on his films, Julie Taymor is very much doing a similar process with her theater experience. So before she is directing films, probably her best known theatrical production is still to this day the 1997 version of The Lion King, which I know some students have had the opportunity to see in past semesters. But if you haven't had a chance to see this, when Broadway finally does reopen, the theaters do reopen, you really should check this out if you can. It's really remarkable. She takes this very like Disney-fied sort of kind of story with anthropomorphic cute animals. We've all seen it. We all know it. She turns it into this marvelously expressive work that is really celebrating African culture. Like, there's a lot of really creative work being done with the costumes to celebrate the richness of African culture. And of course, the second image on this slide is from her film, one of her very first films, if not her very first film, Titus, which you may or may not know is an adaptation of an early William Shakespeare play, Titus Andronicus. And so she has worked very extensively in theater, and most of her films are in some way, shape, or form showing this theatrical heritage. Couple of other films that she has directed. As you can see, she is a very sporadic filmmaker, does not make a movie very often. But at least two of the films that she's made are Shakespeare adaptations. Her version of The Tempest is really cool because it flips the gender on Prospero. It's Helen Mirren playing Prospera instead of an old man playing Prospero. If you've read that play, you know who those characters are. And then a version of A Midsummer's Night's Dream, which is well regarded but virtually unseen. And then more recently, she's also done some biopics of notable feminist figures like Frida Kahlo, the Mexican artist from the 30s and 40s, and Gloria Steinem, the important feminist activist who was from doing things basically in the 60s and 70s, kind of on through today. And most of these films, whether they have a theatrical kind of root or not, are very, very, like, you watch them and you think like, oh, this could be a Broadway production, because they're very heavy on mise-en-scène. They often are putting a lot of emphasis on performance. Like, she is very much an actor's director, Julie Taymor. There's just a lot of things about these films that evoke the theatrical tradition. And again, it makes sense because if you look at her career on the stage, you can really see this is where Julie Taymor spends the vast majority of her time. She is well regarded on the Broadway scene, and just kind of consistently is going back to that well to ply her trade. So Across the Universe is very much coming out of that tradition. Like, if you were sitting there thinking to yourself, this could be a Broadway musical, that's probably why. Even though this film was not written as a Broadway musical, has not yet existed in any form on the stage, this aesthetic of putting the soundtrack first, kind of coming up with the music and the songs, and kind of coming up with the story and the specific shot compositions and all that stuff, kind of after coming up with the sounds, that is very much an inheritance from the Broadway theater tradition. The other place that Julie Taymor is getting this idea is from the long tradition of so-called jukebox musicals, probably the most famous of which is the Beatles film A Hard Day's Night. And these are films that started to emerge in the 50s and in the 60s, kind of like anticipating the modern day music video, where the film was designed as a showcase for like rock groups like the Beatles. Elvis Presley made a number of these films where the film is constantly contriving situations for Elvis to like bust out a guitar and sing a song. And that's another place where Across the Universe is coming from. And it's one of the reasons why the film is set actually in the 1960s and the early 1970s, is because that was a period where a number of these films were being made. So Across the Universe is really kind of existing at the intersection of Taymor's interest in Broadway theater as an artistic experience and this longer history of using music by the Beatles and other rock bands as kind of like the organizing impetus for a movie. So here are some questions that we can use to kind of analyze the sound in Across the Universe, or really in any film that you might be watching. And so what I'm going to do is kind of review these questions, and I'm going to give suggestive answers about how they apply to Across the Universe. But I'm not going to be very exhaustive, because I want you to have an opportunity in your discussion sections to really dive into some of these details, these scenes in more detail. So this is really more your cheat sheet for, okay, I've got a movie in front of me and there's sounds. what do I ask about the sounds to start thinking about how a story is being told and what a filmmaker wants me to take from this or that character, this or that sequence of events. So here they are. Are the sounds diegetic, meaning in the world of the film, or are they non-diegetic, meaning they are being imposed on the film by the filmmakers? Are the diegetic sounds, if you're looking at diegetic sounds, do they come from an on-screen source? Can you see the character or the machine that is producing the sounds? Or are they coming from an off-screen source, somebody who maybe is talking but you're not seeing a shot of them? Or a car radio that you can't actually see in the shot? Are the images synchronized with the images, or are the sounds being placed over images that they don't correspond to? And then lastly, and this comes back to that point I was making earlier about silence, like how much sound do you have? Do you have a lot of sound or just a little? How does that use of sound differ from moment to moment? Is the film constantly bombarding you with loud sounds like a Michael Bay film does, for example? Is it very consistently quiet like an Abbas Kiarostami film, or does it alternate between the two modes in some way? So again, these are not the only questions that you can ask about sound, but these are some questions that if you start asking these about sounds in film, you really can start noticing the ways that filmmakers are manipulating this element of film form to make points about characters and stories. So let's dive into a little bit more depth on some of these points. So are the sounds external diegetic, internal diegetic, or non-diegetic? So there are a couple of different terms that I need to clarify here, which internal diegetic, and external diegetic. Now, Bordwell and Thompson say more about this micro distinction, if you want to call it that, in their textbooks. So definitely check out what they say about diegetic sound. But really, this is just the difference between, this is really just a way of asking this question. Like, can you see the source of the sounds in the film? Who can hear the sounds? Can one or more characters in the film story hear the sounds, or is it just the audience who can hear the sounds? So let's break this down with a few very, very famous film examples. So in each of these films, so you have Rocky, one of the Rocky films on the top left, the original Star Wars on the top right, and then Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho at the bottom. I've selected these three images because if you're looking for like famous uses of music in film, here it is. Here's Rocky. Like Rocky, one of the most iconic moments in Hollywood cinema is Rocky running up the stairs of I think it's the Philadelphia Library, or it's a very important building in Philadelphia. And he's running up the stairs in the snow and the cold. He's training, and they're playing the Rocky theme, like dun 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 dun. Dun. I'm not doing it well, but you know what it is. They're playing that in the background, and it's a really rousing moment in the movie. But Rocky can't hear that music, right? The audience is the only one who can hear that music. That's non-diegetic music. Same thing for Luke Skywalker charging the Death Star at the end of Star Wars: A New Hope. He cannot hear the music. But guess what he can hear? He can hear Obi-Wan Kenobi's voice in his head saying, Luke, like, use the Force, Luke, use the Force. None of the other characters can hear that particular voice. They can't hear Obi-Wan, but Luke can. And so you have one character in the film who can hear Obi-Wan's voice, so it's actually a diegetic sound. But it's an internal diegetic sound because the source of the sound is like Luke's brain, right? Like it's something only he can hear, but the other characters can't hear. Contrasted with the music, where nobody except the audience can hear the music. None of the other characters, Luke, the people telling him what to do, they can't hear John Williams' score. And then you're looking, so you have non-diegetic sound, the music in that clip, internal diegetic sounds, that would be Luke hearing Obi-Wan Kenobi. And then external diegetic sounds, that's all of the space mumbo jumbo, All the bleeps and the boops, the explosions, just all the stuff all the characters can hear. That's external diegetic. Similar kind of breakdown happens in Psycho. Like Bernard Herrmann's famous dun, 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 like score. None of the characters can hear it, just the audience. It's there for our benefit and only our benefit. Janet Leigh's scream, on the other hand, or the sounds of the knife piercing her body, both of the characters can hear those sounds in the scene, so that's a diegetic sound. So just to recap, basically a diegetic sound is a sound that has a source in the film world and at least one other character can hear that sound. If the sound has an external source in the environment and like a lot of characters can hear it, then it's an external diegetic sound. If it's like a voiceover, like in somebody's head, then it's an internal diegetic sound. And then non-diegetic, it's not in the world of the movie, it's just there for our benefit. Now, Across the Universe is tricky because it would seem to have a lot of moments, as most musicals do, where there is non-diegetic sound. And there is actually a lot of non-diegetic sound in Across the Universe. But they are actually pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. Like, most of the moments of non-diegetic music are the very conventional uses of a film score in the background where none of the characters seems to be hearing it. It's just there to spice up the scene and help us, the viewer, read and respond to what these characters are doing. Most of the sounds in this film are some version of diegetic. And this is obviously the case like whenever you have a group of characters singing, like the top scene early in the film where all the bros are hanging out at Princeton and they're all having this like really great moment of camaraderie and they're all singing together and they can all hear each other singing and they pick up where one person starts one verse and the other person finishes it. This is like the clearest example of a diegetic sound in the film. But the film has a lot of other moments, like the one on the bottom, where one character and only one character seems to be doing the singing. And it's an open question as to whether the other characters know that that character is singing or not. And this is a common thing that musicals will do. They will play with this question of, well, what can the other characters hear of this music? Like, how much of the sound is part of the world of the story in an external fashion versus how much of it is just in the characters' heads? And regardless of how you answer that particular question, 9 times out of 10, what you are looking at in Across the Universe is diegetic sound. Because if you think back to those questions of like, okay, how many characters can hear this sound? If your answer is that at least one of those characters can hear those sounds, even if it's just the character making the sounds, as is in the case in the bottom image, you're still dealing with diegetic sound. You're just dealing with diegetic sound being used in a non-realistic way. So really don't get confused by what this film is doing to play around with the whole who can hear the character singing question. If at least one character can hear the music, then that is a diegetic sound. And it's just a question as to whether or not it's an external diegetic sound that the other characters just can't hear because this is the reality of the film, or if it's an internal diegetic sound, which is like a voiceover or something that a character is thinking in their heads that literally none of the other characters can hear because it's a thought that's being given expression in the film, right? So again, long story short, if there's any source for the sound in the film, it's diegetic. If it is 100% exclusively for the viewer's benefit, it is non-diegetic. That's about as clear as the distinction gets. So just don't overcomplicate that one. It really is that simple. So then the other question that you want to think about is the sound off-screen and asynchronous, or is it on-screen and synchronous? And you don't want to think of these necessarily as like they always happen at the same time. Like sometimes you can have an asynchronous sound effect that is happening on screen from an on-screen source, and sometimes you have an off-screen sound that is synchronous. But sometimes these things happen together, and one of the places that does actually happen, where you see one or both of these strategies being used simultaneously or not, is the horror film. And so here are obviously some horror films, some of which you may have seen, some of which you may not have seen. But if you're looking at horror films, a lot of times you'll see a very common sequence play out where a character will hear something, but they don't know where that sound came from. Like you'll have a character who's sitting in a spooky looking house, and all of a sudden there's a loud crash or a creaky kind of sound coming from another part of the house. And it sets off this whole sequence where a character is going to go investigate those sounds. That's your classic use of off-screen sound in the horror film, is when you have a noise and you don't see the source of the noise, and it produces fear in the character and the audience. The asynchronous sound is a little bit trickier in horror films, but this is something that you see when a film wants to suggest that a character is losing their grip on reality. They will play an image, but the image won't have the right sound effect. Or they will play a sound effect over something that shouldn't be producing sound. And then often the move is in a horror film to cut back, and the character's like, "Did you hear that?" And another character's like, "No, I didn't hear anything." And then you start questioning the character's sanity. Another, perhaps more immediate example for off-screen and asynchronous sound came in last week's film, which is Adoration. So you remember Adoration often has these moments where you will see the imagined story of Simon's parents, Rachel and Sammy, played with Simon's narration on top of the image. And it is a clear, when Simon's voice comes on the image of his parents having this intimate moment in bed, we're not seeing Simon, and this sound is coming from a very, very different point in time from these images. And that's your example of off-screen and asynchronous sound, is when you hear Simon's voice over these images of his parents, and you understand intuitively, even before you see a shot of Simon, that he is talking over these pictures from another place and another time. And whereas the effect in a horror film in these moments is to produce fear about the monster that may be lurking off screen, or to make you question the protagonist's sanity or their grip on reality, here the purpose is to help establish the jumbled timeline that the film makes an integral part of its method, as we talked about last week. But it's also to suggest, not totally unrelated actually to the horror film, that Simon's own sense of subjectivity, his own sense of identity, is hopelessly caught between these different places and these different times. So it's another device for establishing that Simon is kind of all over the place emotionally. He's not really a fully complete, psychologically grounded subject at this early point in the film. That will only happen as we get closer and closer to the film's climax. And there are not a lot of examples of this kind of thing being used in Across the Universe, but there are a few very striking examples, and perhaps my favorite is the montage that comes probably about halfway through the film, where Jim is at a very low point psychologically, and Julie Taymor and her collaborators represent that place, psychological headspace, by giving us this crazy montage, again, another term from last week's lecture, where you're cutting all of these images together of what Jim is doing, what his friends are doing, and there's a lot of overlapping and dissolving from one image to the next. And so frequently during this sequence, you have sounds being played over things that shouldn't be making those sounds. Like you'll have bombs being overlaid over strawberries hitting the canvas, or bombs being overlaid over paint hitting the canvas, or you'll have one character singing the lyrics over a montage of what another character is doing. So you'll hear Jim singing the song, but you'll be seeing images of Vietnam and not seeing Jim. And so so you have, this is a good example for both of those tendencies. And as in adoration, the effect here is to suggest a sense of subjective fragmentation. Jim is just like Simon, kind of all over the place mentally, and is having a hard time keeping himself kind of focused on the present. He's really fixated on all of these things that are happening that he doesn't really seem to have any control over. He's really caught up in his emotional depression at this point. And the use of montage and off-screen and asynchronous sound, it helps to destabilize the image and the sequence, and it just gives us a stronger sense as viewers as to how mentally all over the place this character is. So there are other examples. This is not by any means the only one. And so what you want to do is, when you're watching the film, when you're discussing it with the TAs in discussion section, is you want to be thinking about, first and foremost, what kinds of sounds are you noticing in this film? Like, what dialogue are you noticing? Where is the film using sound effects? Where is music being used or not used? And once you have identified those sounds, you want to try as much as you can, given that this is not a music class or a sound class per se, to apply Bordwell and Thompson's specific terms about loudness, about tone, about pitch and frequency to those sounds. And then moving kind of one level up, once you've figured out what sounds you're listening to, ask that second level of questions, which is diegetic or non-diegetic, on-screen, off-screen, synchronized with the images, or being placed in an asynchronous relationship to the images. And then once you have worked out your answers to those questions in relation to a specific moment or a specific scene or a sequence from the film, you just want to ask yourself, what is the sound doing? Like, what is the sound and this particular sequence where the sound is being used telling us about the character at this moment in time? And that's really, I think once you do that with this film, what you start to see is just how much the emotional impact of the story is being communicated primarily through decisions about sound. And so much so that it's not that the images are incidental, that the story is incidental. It's just that it is being used to illustrate and underline qualities that have always kind of been in those Beatles sounds for the last 50, 60 years. So that's what I'm hoping you'll see when you watch Across the Universe. So yeah, there's your sound lecture. I hope you found it useful. And as always, don't hesitate to email me if there are any questions. All right, catch you next time.